Hi, this is a video for dbapresents.com. Working software over comprehensive documentation. Does it sound familiar? This is the second point listed in Agile Manifesto. Do you remember about it every day at work? Do you really understand what it means and why it is so important? I'm sure some of us do not, because I have met two of such persons in the last couple of weeks. Stop doing waterfall in Agile. When I started my career, I worked as a database developer in a waterfall environment. We had to describe each stored procedure and function in the script's header with author, creation date, purpose, input and output parameters. Additionally, each development had to have a business and technical documentation, no matter how small and straightforward it was. I did not challenge the need of such documentation, and I did not see anybody else doing that. I was taught waterfall at university, and comprehensive documentation was a big part of that methodology. That did not seem weird to me at all. Later, I heard about Agile, which questioned multiple waterfall rules and practices, including documentation. It all made sense. Spending huge amount of time on maintaining documentation which is not needed is a waste of time. For newcomers in Agile, the methodology seemed to resign from documentation at all, which is not true, by the way. But creating pages of technical documentation that nobody reads is following waterfall, not Agile. First of all, documentation is not useless by definition. Some kinds in some cases are. Working software over comprehensive documentation means that delivering software that does what it should comes first in the priorities before creating documentation. If for some reasons you have to choose between those two because of time constraints, choose spending time on software development rather than on writing documentation. On the other hand, Agile does not say that you should stop creating documentation completely. Some documents make sense for you and your company. You need to analyze which are needed and which can be dropped. In that context, next time when you are going to create a document, hold on for a minute and find out who needs this documentation and why. If you are unable to find convincing answers, there is a huge probability that nothing bad will happen if you do not deliver that paper. Next, I will provide you with some common cases. Waterfall insisted on creating entity relationship, class, integration, interaction, overview, diagrams and other technical documentation before starting the implementation. Waterfall gurus believed that only experts could decide on architecture or even public methods of Java classes, so such documentation was necessary to show regular developers what structures they should create in the code. Now it is done in a different way. Agile favors emerging architecture and incremental changes, so the need of designing Java classes by architects is no longer mandatory. If a developer needs a diagram to visualize the concept before the implementation, that is fine, but it is not required in the methodology anymore. Stop doing waterfall in Agile. Why you should avoid technical documentation? First, it's hard to keep it up to date. Outdated documentation is worse than no documentation. Second, it is impossible to keep it complete in the long run. Source code contains multiple if statements. I do not believe you are able to include them all in the paper. The same as above, incomplete documentation is worse than no documentation. Third, the only source of technical information that is always up to date is the code itself. Stick to it. If you need documentation because it is difficult to get information from the code, clean the code. Good architecture is easy to understand and to follow. Fourth, developers hate updating technical documentation, and they will avoid doing that, which will result in outdated and incomplete paper. On the other hand, hiring a non-technical person to maintain technical documentation is wrong by definition. Of course, you might have a case when some kind of documentation makes sense. If it does for you, create and maintain one. 20 years ago, business analysts produced business requirement documents, BRD, and functional requirement document, FRD, to have the arrangement with client written down before engaging developers. It was that way in a waterfall. Agile requires Scrum team to work on a user story which does not describe the functional requirement but a user need or a problem. Scrum team should deal with a pure user issue, not just implement what is written in FRD. Stop doing waterfall in Agile. Why you should avoid business documentation? First, whatever is written in the documentation, that will have to be implemented, because we promised it to the client, even if you realize later that the client needs something else. Second, after implementing a feature, the paper is useless, because its purpose was to provide requirements to developers. I know someone may tell you that you can refer to it in the future to prove that your product works as agreed. But really? Is it the way how you want to work with your clients? To argue what was in the paper, not whether it really solves the business case? Agile is about delivering software that has business value, not what was in a contract. Of course, you might have a case when some kind of documentation makes sense. If it does for you, create and maintain one. When I began my journey with computers, I used Windows 95 and I remember how I hated accidentally pressing F1 key on my keyboard. The whole system frozen. After a few minutes, a message box appeared with information that help content is being indexed and I should wait. Then I was able to finally kill the process and go back to what I was doing. I do not remember using built-in help in programs I used. When I do not know how to do something, I use an internet search engine to find an answer. If you struggle with writing user manual, think about creating a user community, a forum where they could exchange information how to effectively use your software. I know it's easy to do for programs that is used by millions of users, but even for applications dedicated to a narrow group of people, it's doable. It will require your engagement to answer users' questions and to keep the community active. But I'm sure it is a more interesting job than writing a documentation and definitely better for users. Stop doing waterfall in Agile. Of course, you might have a case when some kind of documentation makes sense. If it does for you, create and maintain one. With Scrum, you do not have to create and maintain documentation. You may consider it and make a conscious decision which documents are worth to keep in each case.